Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Kite Runner research paper here. I wanted to get this out a little bit ago, but just haven't had time yet. So every student should receive at the beginning of this paper a kind of organizer. Let that kind of clear up a little bit. Focus. There it is. An organizer that helps with this process. So we started this out with, figuring out just a general topic for, what it was you're going to be, hoping to write about. The examples here are terrorism or the Taliban, but there were many other options. This actually was, here we go. This was the first page we focused on, and there were some other examples down there like Sharia law or branches of conflicts, some of the customs and traditions of Middle East. So there was really an open-ended way of doing this. Once we got our general topic down, in the research process, really we start talking about what research is, and it's, we're searching for an answer, which means we have some kind of generalized question of some kind. And so the organizer helps in this process by laying out, what question or questions did you have about the topic before going into research. It's about this time where I see the most struggles that students have, because moving on from that and jumping into, say, the thesis statement, combining our general topic with our question, it also assumes that you have started your research and you have done a close enough reading of that research that you have some answers to move forward. It's difficult to set up a thesis statement which is going to kind of define the answer that you found without having the answers, without having the information in the first place. And so I really stress to students, before we got to this stage, we should have at least found 3 resources that we haven't just, chosen and, kind of checked off of our list of duties, but we've actually gone through them and read them and decided, this resource really does provide me with good information. It helps. Because the unfortunate, in being a student, the unfortunate truth is that you may do research, read through the whole article, and realize this is not a good resource for me. That's just part of the research process. Some of it isn't going to be useful. And so you do have to find those useful, good, strong, credible sources. Once we've done that, then this is true. The general topic combined with your question will become your thesis. And the organizer provides you with a couple of examples. In this one here, it says, if your topic was terrorism and your main question was, why does terrorism exist, then your thesis might look something like this. When I first began my research into the causes of worldwide terrorism, I believed that most terrorists were religious fanatics determined to destroy anyone who didn't follow their belief system. However, I soon discovered, and this is where the thesis kind of comes in, this is where the answer in the research comes in. However, I soon discovered that the causes of terrorism were much more complicated than I had expected. Now, for a 10th grader in high school, I like this thesis and this process because a thesis statement has to be open enough to actually build a paper around, and also it has to be closed and kind of specific enough so that our paper is not going to be 300 pages and going off into many, many, many different topics. This one leads us right into, we're going to talk about the causes of terrorism, and we've left it at a spot where we've said, it's more complicated than I had first expected, which tells us, there's going to be multiple reasons. I've got enough room now for enough research and for enough information to go in and build an essay around, rather than it just being one paragraph And certainly, we don't want it to be too many paragraphs to where we can't actually finish this in an organized manner. And so that's about as far as we are right now. We're working on an introductory paragraph. Once we get an intro paragraph down, really once we get that thesis statement down, the rest of the paper is almost like filling in the spaces. Our body paragraphs are going to add support for that. Obviously, this paper is going to start with body paragraph number one of the causes of terrorism. What are they? And then, building the rest of that paragraph with support, having all the pieces and development like topic sentences and conclusions that are going to help with organization. But having the thesis is the hardest part. So we did a couple more examples. I just chose Afghan customs as another general topic. And I said, what question did I have about the topic before doing that research? Well, I came up with a couple here, and I said, why do women wear the full, complete headdress or covering? So, we know that there's the burqa. There's a lot of talk about that in the last few decades, maybe even further than that. I'm just thinking from my own personal experience about, women's rights in Middle Eastern culture. What is that all about? So it's always one of the top kind of questions students might have. Like, what is that thing all about? Why do they have to wear that? What holidays do people in Afghanistan celebrate? We just finished up Thanksgiving here, so we're approaching Christmas, so it's on my mind. And then kind of combining them to, do people have freedoms in Afghanistan? The idea of freedoms, personal freedom and choice, especially with the headdress, the burqa thing, it's just in the back of my mind, so I put that down. And kind of moving from there, again, taking the general topic and then also combining it with some of the research and the answer, we can build a thesis statement. I'll show you what I've done there. Now, what I really want to focus on here and reiterate is that the writing process is never, I think we'll do it this way. It's never perfect, okay? It's never immediate. That's the word I want. So here's what I kind of sort of settled on when I reached kind of a point where I was ready to move on to other parts of the intro. I just wrote, before I began my research, I'm following that same pattern in the example, which is perfectly okay. Before I began my research, I questioned Afghanistan's freedoms. However, I realized that some of these were based on their culture, customs, and traditions. And you'll notice that I've got some red pen here. It's because as I got to this point, there are things I'm still not satisfied with. The language, the syntax, the sentence structure, but that's the writing process. I can go back and change that later. The main important thing here is that I have a thesis now which is giving me direction and I can move forward. And just to show you, this was my second kind of draft. I started up here very similarly. So, and I had some other things crossed out, and I've got lines and arrows going everywhere. I didn't like my verb. I had something that I had started, and I said, well, I don't need that here, and I got all kinds of things crossed out. Writing is a process. You have to start someplace, and you can kind of chop, trim, add as you go until you finally say, you know what, this is exactly where I want it to be. So having this second draft of my thesis here, combining my general topic and some of the research that I have done, we move on to the rest of the thesis, or the rest of the introductory paragraph information, which is, adding in a hook. So an intro paragraph should really include two things. It's going to include a hook plus that thesis statement. In 7th grade, we cover hook and thesis statement almost as if it was 4 sentences long. And it's because I share some hook techniques with 7th graders, trying to teach them how to create a hook. However, by the time we get into upper high school, we should realize that it's more than that. We need to build this into something that's conversational. You have to think of, being a writer kind of like you were two people at once. You are the writer, but you also have to be aware of who your audience is. What questions might they have as they're reading through your work? What questions might they have that you could answer right now in this technique, in this hook, rather than them being confused in the process. 7th grade, we always focus on the imagine technique, which is kind of like taking the word imagine and writing it 3 different ways. You're asking the reader to picture something in their mind. Imagine walking down a beach, a long beach with sand and waves and a beautiful sunset. You're building that imagery into their mind, and if it's a kind of a pretty picture or maybe a even shocking picture, you're grabbing their attention and you're keeping them interested, which is the whole purpose of what a hook is supposed to do. Bring the reader into your paper. That could potentially work for a topic like Afghanistan's customs. Did we go to a black screen there? Is it still going? Yes. Sorry. That could work with a topic like Afghanistan's customs and traditions. The question technique is very similar, and I find this one to be easy to use with historical type of topics. Just like the imagine technique, you were asking very poignant questions, something that might draw an audience's interest. But when you do that, rather than just simply list 3 questions and then move into a thesis statement, make it conversational. Ask a question and then answer that question. Discuss that question. Why is it an important question to ask? Don't go too far, or your hook and thesis is going to create an intro that is just too long. And I'm going to show you mine here in a second, and it's almost on the border of maybe too much. But you just don't want it to be 4 simple sentences that sounds too robotic. It doesn't have any flow. It doesn't transition from one idea into the next, especially when an imagine technique or a question technique each of those might be vastly different ideas. They could be connected to the topic, but they might not flow well between each other. Anecdotal techniques. So an anecdote is like a personal story that you might share. That can work as a hook technique as long, again, as you can relate it to your overall topic, your thesis statement. It makes sense. That's fine. These 2 here are very similar, shock and awe. So the idea here is to shock or awe the reader when they're in there, and so you might throw in a fact that is amazing, that makes the reader ponder and think and kind of be amazed and say, wow, this is very interesting, I'm going to keep reading. Throwing the reader into the action can work with certain topics that are very how do I say this? I always use the idea of battle as an example. If your story is going to include war and battle, you might throw them into the middle of some kind of a scene right off the bat, and so they're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? I better keep reading to find out. That's the basis behind that. So strong verbs, you're kind of painting a picture at that point, like the imagine technique. But it can be successful. And then another one that people often use, and you got to be careful with this one, is using a famous quote that's out there. You can do some research and find one that's related. The biggest mistake I see with borrowing quotes is that students might not explain the quote. They just put it down, and then they think, oh, my job is done. Well, no, you kind of have to, again, build it to be conversational, but by doing so, explain the connection to the quote and avoid those real cliche, overused types of quotes and sayings out there that don't have much energy anymore. Find something that's a bit fresher and explain its connection to your thesis. So what I chose here is I thought about, the imagine technique and the question technique, and how could I kind of get that started? Well, I started with just some generic questions and, building a picture here. So the first question I thought that would be poignant enough and, connected enough: How would you feel going through your day wearing a covering on your face with only your eyes showing? I'm not crazy yet about the wording of that sentence. It sounds a little bit wordy, but I've got a question started, and I find it to be related enough because in my topic I was talking about, that covering, that burqa, and the idea of freedoms, and I was thinking also, in our culture in the West, we're constantly fighting for personal freedoms, fighting about freedom of choice, freedom of expression. There's the topic of school uniforms and the things that students sometimes wear on their clothes that are deemed inappropriate by certain people. And there's that kind of universal fight that's always out there. And so that was my first question. I felt it was related, and it built that enough energy to serve as a hook. The second one I kind of combined. I went with an imagine. Okay, imagine marrying a man that you've hardly or even never spoken to. So this connects again to that Afghanistan, that Middle Eastern kind of tradition or custom out there. That can be kind of shocking to Western teenagers, especially, or anyone really. But it's still somewhat of a practice. You might even say common practice for arranged marriages in some cultures. And number 3, I said, would you put your life's education second to the wishes of others? And I was kind of thinking here, one of the common topics in Afghanistan culture is, especially for female roles, you see a lot of, not strange, but differing educational opportunities for females in these cultures. Just studying education, in some cases, females don't get through beyond, say, elementary school before their education ends, and that depends too historically on who's in charge, who's ruling at the current time, and so there's a historical tie-in to that. But nevertheless, this serves as a strong hook for my paper, and so this is how I kind of put them together then. And you should see each one of the questions kind of showing up, maybe with a little bit of editing going on, because I did change it as we went. How would you feel going through the day with a burqa, a covering that only allows the eyes to be shown? Okay, and that's a question mark there. But now I'm going to continue that idea. People in the United States and other Western cultures loudly cry against the freedoms of expression, such as school uniforms or even dress codes. Okay? And so I've combined the question with a little bit of conversational development, which brings it, further than just that question. Next question. Now, imagine stepping into one of the most sacred moments of life, marriage. What if one of the most What if you had never spoken to the man you were about to marry? This is still a common practice in Afghan culture. Okay, so again, it throws in that idea, that technique we had, but it develops it. It continues to talk about it. It makes it conversational. It goes a little bit further. Finally, just adding these little transitions in there too can help flow from between these ideas. Finally, as a female, would you accept putting your education second to the wishes of someone else? Maybe the husband that you hardly know? Before I began my research, and bam, we can see this right here. Here's where that transition between my hook technique that I was using and what I had prepared before as my thesis statement, it kind of makes its way into this. Before I began my research, I questioned Afghanistan's freedoms. However, I realized that in some cases, culture created by the people is stronger, even widely accepted, even more widely accepted than the beliefs of Western people. And again, you can see I've got things crossed out here. I'm just drafting as I go, and that's okay. What I want you to see is how the technique along with, what we learned with the organizer, can be put together. Now, this looks like a whole bunch of text. It's because it's handwritten. We don't see that very often anymore. If I type this out, this would be a very well-developed beginning point for my paper. I can continue this on and start working on my body paragraphs now, supporting my thesis statement. I'm going to start talking about the culture and the fact that, some of these things that are taking place are not, say, just terrible violations of humanity or human freedoms. There's a difference between cultures, and in some cases they're perfectly normal in those places. So I hope this helps kind of, develop the hook a little bit and really make it more than just 4 sentences long. Figure it out to make it conversational. And also, I hope it helps build that thesis statement if it wasn't obvious enough from, our organizer in the first place. That's kind of what we're doing here. Take that general topic, combine it with your question, do your research, and then combine them together, kind of with an answer so that everything, comes out and makes sense, and you can continue your paper from there.